This is Surviving Ministry, conversations designed to help you last longer and grow stronger in ministry. I'm your host, Seth Stevens.
And I was ministering as a layperson and teaching and studying the Bible. Now, your blood doesn't become bibline just by reading and studying. Your blood becomes bibline by putting it into practice. You know, what do I need to do to be fruitful and effective and faithful in the ministry that I have? So if you've got a message, you know, it's a burning message and it affects your whole body. You've got to have your whole life integrated into your ministry and your ministry integrated into your life. Okay, I was afraid you were going to ask that because now you're exposing my weaknesses that get covered.
This episode's guest is Sandy Willson, and we talk about just about everything. We talk about transitions from business to ministry, deciding to leave a church after 22 years. We discuss patterns of prayer and work, sermon preparation, how to align a staff, modeling leadership when you are overruled, and the importance of taking on a pastoral identity, and much, much more. Just a note, there was a little audio interference in this podcast, and at one point I briefly stopped to try and fix it. But interestingly enough, that led us to talking about embodied preaching, so I left it in. Without further ado, here is episode 2 of Surviving Ministry. Today on Surviving Ministry, I have the privilege to be working with Sandy Willson. Sandy has been a pastor for many years in Memphis and is now doing some consulting work as well as interim church work for his denomination. Sandy's actually one of the reasons why I started this podcast. When I was first in ministry, I was kind of struggling, getting beaten down in the initial barrage of ministry responsibilities as a part of a new position, and came to him really to help me out. And the advice he gave was really good, really insightful, really encouraging for me. And I just thought, I've got to get this information out to other people. So thank you, Sandy, for number one, helping me, and number two, joining us today to talk a little bit about your experiences in ministry and to share some of what God's taught you throughout the years.
I'm always glad to be with you, Seth.
Now, you actually didn't start out in ministry. The Lord brought you into ministry kind of through a roundabout way. Do you mind sharing how the Lord called you into ministry and what that transition was like?
Yeah, I started off in undergraduate work. I did electrical engineering, believe it or not. But before I finished my degree, I realized I'm not really cut out to be a professional engineer. So I started selling in the sales and marketing department for Bethlehem Steel Corporation. And they moved me to New England. I'd grown up in church, but I really wasn't converted at that point. Yeah. But I was married. And Allison, my wife, also had grown up in church. But I think she would say, too, she was not converted at that point. So we were really good hypocrites, but not regular hypocrites.
It's a dangerous skill to have.
That's right. So we would attend church, twice a year, just to kind of touch base with our history.
Yeah.
And what happened was I went to a church, on my 6-month cycle and got nabbed.
Yeah.
And just through some gracious people who just wouldn't let us go. And it's a longer story I won't go into. So that's
so they kind of grabbed you and latched onto you. And
they did. They actually wouldn't let me get my child out of the nursery until I went to the coffee hour.
Oh, wow.
And so I went to the coffee hour, and that's when things began.
So they held your child hostage.
They did, actually, yeah. I mean, in a nice way. So 6 weeks later, we got converted in that church in New England. And I never dreamt of being a pastor.
Yeah.
But I did.
How old were you when that occurred?
I was converted at 25.
25, okay.
Yeah, and I did, Seth, I found out later that that's for people in full-time Christian service or in pastoral work, that's relatively late.
Yeah.
I was with a group of pastors. Well, actually, it was the Gospel Coalition.
Yeah.
Initial group of 50 pastors or so. Mark Dever was kind of, introducing us to each other, and so he had us sit down, and he said, everybody stand up. Those who are converted, at the age of 8, sit down. About half the crowd sat down. And on it went. These are all pastors. And I was one of the 2 last standing who had been converted in their 20s. So that really dawned on me that it's important that we reach youth. And I wish I had been converted much earlier, because it puts you on a track of preparation much earlier. Now, folks like me who get converted late, we can still be pastors, but you feel like you're swimming upstream a bit.
Do you think there's some advantages to it in reaching people who come to Christ later, or having a passion for that?
There is, but there is. I certainly have a higher sympathy for men and women in the workplace who are Christians, because I know how many times I failed spiritually in the workplace. So I have probably a deeper sympathy than some other pastors might. But what I'm saying is, I don't think I was as well developed as some of my colleagues who pastor similar churches.
You felt like you had to play catch up a little bit.
I did. And even, in undergraduate school, to delve into the liberal arts and to be examining God's creation from a Christocentric perspective, I think is really helpful. And I missed all that.
Yeah.
So I've always rued the fact that I came to Christ late, even though, as you point out, I have to say there were some advantages, but they're on the backside. Yeah.
So from that was your conversion experience. Then how did the Lord start drawing you into ministry?
Yeah, I had a real sense, a good, Reformed evangelical sense of being a Christian in the workplace, and that my work was as valuable as anybody else's, including the pastor. However, each spring I would be sure that I was in Boston. I lived in the Boston area.
Yeah.
And I traveled the region, but when Park Street Church had their missions conference, I always planned to be in Boston so I could walk across the Common and go to Park Street Church. And I went, and the sermons were on Jonah.
Yeah.
I don't know how to say it, except that I had this sensation that I was on my way to Tarshish. And the Lord just convicted me that I was 28 at the time. And I just had this sense that, with the years I likely had ahead of me, that I was not investing them in the best way. That was the deep conviction. And I really wrestled over it, because I did not want to be disrupted out of my work.
Yeah.
But the Lord just worked me over.
At what age was that?
27, 28.
27, 28. So about 3 years after that.
That's right. It was 3 years after conversion.
Okay.
But meanwhile, I had been involved in teaching in the church, leading youth.
Yeah.
Someone was asking me just today, I think I want to be in pastoral ministry. How do I confirm that? And I just said, get in ministry.
Yeah.
That's what I did. That's how it all happened. It was organic. And I was ministering as a layperson and teaching and studying the Bible. And so you can't
minister before you decide to do it for a living.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And then what happens is the church just sucks it out of you. They draw you in, and they're basically looking at you and saying, would you allow us to lay aside some of your time and send you to seminary? That's basically what happened.
Oh, wow, that's great.
Yeah.
You've recently gone through a kind of a different transition. We'll go from the beginning a little bit to the end, and you've recently retired from second pres, being the senior minister there. I'm not sure what do y'all call it, the senior minister there?
Yeah.
Okay. Retired from that, but not retired from the ministry, and now you're kind of entering into a new phase of ministry. You're doing some consulting. You're doing some interim church work. How did you decide it was time for you to transition, and what have you kind of enjoyed in this new season of ministry?
Yeah, it has been a transition. It's been a good one. I was at Second Presbyterian in Memphis for 22 years.
Oh, wow.
And I had thought a decade ago that I'd probably serve until I was about 69. But what happened was I'm now 67. And I retired 2 years ago. So the reason I retired at 66, so it was a year, almost 2 years ago. So the reason I did, Seth, was that I've been in pastoral work long enough to know that every church goes through seasons.
Yeah.
And sometimes you feel a little besieged. There are things going on that are deeply spiritual sometimes, where they're just rocky roads. And then sometimes you're in a real pleasant, broad, open space. And I realized as I got closer to 70 that it was putting things at risk a little bit to assume that when I got to 69, that was going to be a good time to retire.
Yeah.
But I knew at 64, this is a good time.
Yeah.
So rather than minimizing my options by letting the clock go on, I thought, let's go now. So I announced 2 years ahead of time.
You never want to leave when everybody says, yeah, it was time.
Well, that's true too.
You want to leave when they say, we'd love to keep you.
That's true, but you also don't want to leave when you have major problems.
Oh, yeah.
And if we had had major problems, I wouldn't have retired, because that doesn't leave the church in good health. The bottom line answer is this, for maybe some of your older listeners who are thinking about how you make a transition or when you make a transition. This doesn't answer it completely, but it gives you the framework. And the framework is this: what is in the interest of this church? That's your only question. It has nothing to do with your retirement program, your financial state, what you want to do, whether your family is adjusted or not. Those things are not the first questions. Those are all second questions. The first question is, what is in the interest of the people you're serving? And if you can really get your mind in that frame, you're going to be in a much better place to make a wise decision. So, for example, when I retired, I didn't even look at my finances until I had already decided it was in Second Presbyterian's interest for me to make this transition now. Mm-hmm. And, it really worked out well. We had a wonderful transition season, and Dr. George Robertson has come in and is doing a wonderful job, so I'm very grateful. But it's that paradigm shift for most people. You've got to get outside your own skin, your own interests, and really think of the people you're serving.
Yeah. From earlier conversations we've had, one of the things I want to ask you about is, maintaining kind of a sense of order in your own spiritual life, in your devotional life as you get into ministry. Because, when I was kind of thrown into a position where it seemed as though the responsibilities outweighed my competency, it was a real struggle to, okay, how do I get everything done, and then how do I keep the important things from being overwhelmed by the urgent things? Because in ministry, there's so many urgent things, whether it's funerals or crisis of leadership or things like that approach you. Do you have any advice for people who are dealing with those type of issues?
Yeah. Sometimes you have crises that come upon you, 2 funerals in 1 week or 3 funerals in 1 week or things like that, or someone is on their deathbed last minute on a Saturday afternoon, and how do you control all this? You don't. So what I think you've got to do is to try to stay ahead of it as much as possible. So you don't wait till Saturday afternoon to prepare your sermon. Then you're vulnerable. You're inflexible, and then you can be overwhelmed. And so you've just got to do a better job of planning. So I would say, get your calendar out and take responsibility for your whole calendar. Plan it out nicely. If you don't decide if you don't deploy yourself, there are 50 other people that would be happy to tell you how to spend your life. Yeah. So you got to be able to tell them.
And they all believe God's on their side.
Exactly. So you need to be able to tell them how you're spending your life. So I would just say, to begin with, get on the offensive. Take the initiative. Control the calendar. So what I did was I put the big rocks in first. What do I need to do for personal devotions? What do I need to do for sermon preparation and teaching preparation? And then the rest of the time, I allowed, I had the pleasure and privilege of having an assistant. I allowed her to schedule the times in those blocks that I gave her. And then I'm going to schedule the time on those other blocks that I didn't give her. And those are my study time and my own personal time. Now, I can't always control that. Somebody can end up in the hospital. But if I'm planning ahead, I usually have 3 or 4 days to manipulate the schedule to catch up, to make up for the emergency. Doesn't always work, but 98% of the time it works. Yeah. If you'll plan ahead.
Now, you mentioned putting the big rocks in first. For those who haven't heard that analogy, explain that real quick.
Yeah, well, it's one of Stephen Covey's analogies. He says, if you have a bunch of big rocks and some gravel and some sand and some water, how are you going to get it all in this big jar? If you put the sand in first, you're not going to get the big rocks in. So you put the big rocks in first, then you put the gravel, and they gather around the big rocks. And the sand will, sprinkle down, and then the water. So put the big rocks in first, and then you can get everything in there. So you have to figure out what in your life are the big rocks, and your time with the Lord and cultivating your own soul and relationship with Him, and then your preparation for ministering God's word. Those are all big rocks.
Yeah.
And your worship times, corporately and privately. And then everything fits around that. But you got to put the pegs in first.
Yeah.
And then it just takes discipline to stick to it.
Yeah. I think that, ministering and maintaining the connection with the Lord, I think it can be difficult for ministers because everything kind of revolves around that, yet you don't always prioritize the private because you're doing it so much publicly. But in a lot of ways, we can only give what we've got. And if we aren't maintaining that deep relationship with the Lord, it's hard to exhort others into something we're out of.
Yeah.
Now, for you, as you kind of scheduled out your week and your prayer life and things like that, how did you structure it? Give us, your example, which can, is obviously just a template that people can use and manipulate for their own.
Yeah, I mean, there's so many different ways to do it, and people like to read the Bible at different rates and different ways. I just think, for me, it's very helpful to get through the Bible every year. So, you can get Table Talk, or you can get McShane's schedule, or there are many other Bible reading schedules. And, you may miss a day or two, but just pick up where you left off and seek to be reading the Bible all the time so that, as Spurgeon says, your blood becomes bibline. Now, your blood doesn't become bibline just by reading and studying.
Yeah.
Your blood becomes bibline by putting it into practice. That's how you develop wisdom, is by obedience to the Scripture, and then you're gradually developing discernment as you obey the Lord and obey His Word. But you have to read it first. You have to learn it. So regular reading of the Bible is essential, and I just find it so sad, Seth, that you can go in some contemporary churches that call themselves evangelical, and in the service itself, you hardly hear the Bible read, and you don't hear much of the teaching from the Scriptures in the sermon even. So we really have got to recover the Bible as the source of our certainty, our knowledge. And then as far as prayer goes, I'm not a great prayer. I'm more of an activist, and I know that about myself, so I have to put on a discipline. So what I do is I take each day of the week, and I break up my intercessory prayer list into sevenths.
Okay.
And so each day of the week has an assignment, and I find that it's more manageable. And I just have to. I say that confessionally.
Yeah.
That I'm not good enough to get through my whole list every day. So
But you recognize that and try and
I'm just
deal with
accommodating to my weaknesses somewhat, but at least it keeps me from being overwhelmed.
Now, what would you pray for on Monday through Sunday?
Okay, well, Monday I pray for the congregation, and so if you have 3,500 members, you can't pray the whole list, but you rotate it. So I'll take a certain portion of the church list each of the 52 weeks, and and I can pray through.
So then, not just generally, you would kind of take a Rolodex and pray for individuals.
Yeah.
Oh, that's great.
Yeah, in a smaller church, I would actually try to get all their pictures up on my wall on a bulletin board, so that for prayer and for sermon preparation, I would look at faces and think about their lives while I'm preparing the sermon. That's another topic. Yeah. Tuesday I pick up with my family, largely my immediate family, and if you know them, there's a lot to pray for there.
We won't ask you about that.
Wednesday I pray for church officers.
Okay.
And that's elders and deacons. Thursday, I generally pray for the world and the city because that's sermon preparation day, and it goes nicely with that. Friday, I pray for church staff. And, at Second Presbyterian, we had 130 staff, so it's a lot of people to pray for. Saturday, I prayed for missionaries and pastors. And that was also a good day to do that because I'm, bringing this. I'm an audio person. I'm instead of visual. So I have a oral manuscript that I usually am working with. So Saturday is important for me to bring it all back up and get it in my head. So it's a great day to pray for other pastors and
Yeah.
missionaries. And then Sunday, it's praying for myself.
Which is important.
Yes, it
You
is.
need some work too.
Yeah, and it's a day of rest. So,
Yeah.
even though I'm ministering publicly, my chief intercessory concern is my own holiness and growth in the Lord on Sunday. So that's the way I've broken it up. And, I can't say that I'm massively successful, but it's easier than trying to pray everything every day
Yeah.
for me. I'm just not Martin Luther, 2 hours a day.
Yeah. Yeah.
Or 3.
Not many of us are. Or Susanna Wesley.
Bingo.
Now, you mentioned that I think you said Thursday was your preparation day, and you mentioned kind of some other things. So it sounds like you've not only divided up your prayer, but you've also divided your work into certain days and categories. And I think from our last conversation, even parts of the day you've committed to certain activities. Tell a little bit how you dedicate your time throughout the week and throughout the day around the responsibilities that you had.
Yeah. Well, everybody's different and every church is different. So for your younger adult listeners, you don't want to copy somebody else.
Yeah.
But the general principles maybe you can apply.
Mm-hmm.
And the general principle would be, what do I need to do to be fruitful and effective and faithful in the ministry that I have? What kind of time needs to be devoted to Bible study, to personal counsel, leadership development, missional engagement, public appearances to do this, that, or the other. It's just all kinds of things. So, and also I have to know my personality. I'm right on the line between extroverted and introverted, so I'm about equally both.
Yeah.
So I put all that together, and what worked for me at Second Presbyterian was, Monday is a big staff day.
Mm-hmm.
You come in from the chaos of Sunday, you're looking at the chaos of the next week, and it just seemed to me it was good for us all to put our heads together and our hearts together on Monday, and then we can leave each other alone for the rest of the week because we're all aligned.
Would that occur in the mornings or the evenings?
Well, it's morning
sorry,
and
afternoon.
Morning
Okay.
and afternoon. So we had staff devotions every Monday. We would worship and get a homily and share prayer concerns and pray for each other. The whole staff would.
Mm-hmm.
We also had meetings, that are necessary, liturgy meetings, worship times, planning meetings, all kinds of staff meetings.
Yeah.
All that would take place on Mondays so that you're free the rest of the week. And so if you connect and align early in the week, I found that you could kind of trust that your colleagues are going in the same direction the rest of the week. And then I would take Tuesday off. A lot of pastors take Monday off, but I much preferred to be a little tired on Monday, work hard, 12 hours usually, sometimes 16 on Monday, to get everything aligned, including officers' meetings, once a month on Monday nights. And by the end of that exhausting day, I was exhausted, ready for a break, but I could take a break knowing that the week was aligned and that we had worked together, knowing where we're going that week. So it worked well for me to come home on Tuesday.
To take us on a little bit of a tangent here, in a multiple staff setting, what was the process of alignment and what did you view as its core purpose in these meetings?
Yeah, you have all kinds of alignment that's necessary. At the simplest level, you've got chronological alignment. You have to get your calendars together. Mm-hmm. Be sure we all know what we're doing this week and that we're not working at cross purposes and trying to have big meetings at the same time.
Yeah.
It's just a little simple.
Scheduling.
Yeah, just scheduling, logistics. And then problems have arisen over the weekend that we become aware of. Or someone got sick in the hospital and we need to be sure the right people know about it and that we're on it. And then, of course, you've got philosophical alignment. Things come up, ministry programs we're going to do. How are we thinking about that? What are we trying to accomplish? And just as the senior leader, I realize you have to talk through those things all the time. Mm-hmm. Don't assume that because you said it 6 months ago, we're all on the same page. We're not.
People need to be reminded.
They do, and you need. And if you're the senior minister, you're the biggest group you want to develop is your own pastoral college. So I want to work with those guys, and especially the younger ones, and be sure they see how ministry philosophy applies in every case, including this program we're going to do this week. What are we trying to accomplish? So it's just a number of things. And then, of course, when you're planning worship, you've got musicians and liturgists and, all different kinds of people with their interests, pastors and teachers, trying to put their heads together to agree to what we're going to do in worship the next 2 or 3 weeks. Then on Tuesday, I would take off, and I would take half a day off. The other half, I would plan my men's Bible study, which I did every Thursday morning at 6:30. As you know, we had an hour-long, basically Bible teaching, and I just worked expositionally through books of the Bible on Thursday mornings with men. Half of Tuesday would be devoted to that. Wednesday was a church day. Thursday, I would work on my Sunday morning sermon. So that's what I meant about working on a sermon, Sunday morning sermon on Thursday, with interruptions, but I'd be in my study all day Thursday, basically. Friday is another church day, and these are counseling times, premarital counseling, marital counseling, pastoral counseling of all sorts, meeting with staff that wanted individual meetings. Then on Saturday, I take another half day off, and then the latter half of Saturday, I'd complete the Sunday morning message. Now, if you put a gun at my head...
Kind of polish it.
Yes, if you put a gun at my head Thursday night, I could preach it. But the application and having it in my bones, it's going to be better because of Saturday afternoon.
Now, one of the terms I use when I think some about sermon preparation is marinating. And it seems like kind of the early in the week you can get it in your mind and then leave it off and then come back to it. A lot of times, I don't know if it's the subconscious or having it just floating around in there helps it grow. Did you find, doing it on Thursday initially, leaving it alone a little bit and then coming back to it helped you develop it? Okay.
It does. Also, you get away from that initial preparation and you realize, I'm being way too technical.
Yeah.
Or that's boring. That needs to be applied and illustrated. I've got to think this through some more. So, you get away from it and you start thinking more about your hearers rather than the one who's delivering it. So I think that time is good. The other thing I'd say is this, 2 things. One is you'll notice I told you I'm right on the line between extroverted and introverted. So what did I do? Monday, Wednesday, Friday were people days. Tuesday, Thursday, Saturday were internal days. So that suited my temperament. People tell me I have high energy and that I work hard and all that. Well, I do, and I do have high energy. But they don't realize I've got my way to squirrel away. And I'm renewed, when I'm alone with the Lord and studying His Word.
And it seems like you've built in these kind of cycles of refreshment and patterns that help deal with your personality and what it needs.
That's right. Now, on preaching, the other thing about marinating is I suggest for preachers that you schedule your sermons way ahead of time. So my texts and titles are chosen between now, this is in December, between now and July.
Yeah.
And I'm often a full year ahead. Now, I can interrupt that anytime I want to. When 9/11 took place, believe me, we had 4 sermons that were not previously scheduled. But generally speaking, if you're going expositionally through books of the Bible, you can schedule it. Therefore, whenever I see a television program or hear something on the news, I'm thinking, what text does that apply to? Yeah. So I'm marinating on several sermons all week long. So it's not just the week of. So I've got, of course, this week's sermon is especially in my head, but I'm thinking about other sermons too. So that's the advantage of planning your text, is that you have filing categories for things that you're reading and hearing during the week.
So if you hear something, you might think, oh, in a couple weeks, that might be applicable to what we're doing then.
Absolutely. I mean, I had an illustration last week because we were talking about, through Him, all things were made, in John 1. A Stephen Hawking illustration, came to me 6 weeks ago. Well, I just make a note of it. When you get to creation, through the Word, Christ, this will be applicable, and it was. So, you're always filing, and if you'll plan, you can file better.
I'm going to move these.
We're making too much noise for you.
C.S. Lewis once referred to somebody as one of those terribly annoying people who fails to talk with their hands. So, and that's one thing I actually notice about good communicators is they use their hands a lot. I tend to underutilized mind, but I can tell you're a communicator just by the way you use your hands. But yeah, when it rattles those, I just want to make sure the audio is clean.
Well, let me tell you, you not only use your hands, but let me tell you, you may know this story, but when Martin Lloyd-Jones first went to Westminster Chapel, he was coming from Wales, and he was the new preacher, at Westminster. And the prior pastor had, in his pulpit, he had a sort of a rail that went around the pulpit with a drape on it. And Lloyd-Jones took the drape down. And they said, "Why are you doing that?" And he said, "They've got to see my feet."
Wow.
And so, I've thought about that. I think it's true, because what happens in preaching, Wesley said it, people come to watch me set myself on fire and watch me burn.
Yeah.
So if you've got a message, it's a burning message, and it affects your whole body and your whole soul. So I think the one thing I do like about maybe the changing of the pulpits these days is that you see the whole preacher physically.
Yeah.
And there's something about that, because I don't do it intentionally. It's just that I guess I speak with my hands because I'm in this.
Yeah.
It's got me.
I have the problem of I'm in my head more than my body.
Yeah, there you go.
And that's something I try and be conscious about. All right, but get it into the rest of your body. You know,
we have therapists for that, Seth.
That's true. I probably need that as well. Did you preach from a manuscript or an outline, or would you just go up there without anything? I kind of have changed around what I do and tried different things. What have you tried, and what do you find works for you?
Yeah, I basically, like I say, have an oral manuscript.
Okay.
I don't have a photograph.
What do you mean by that?
Well, I mean that I've thought it through.
Yeah.
I may have articulated it. I usually don't, but I have in my head, and it has a way of coming back to you. Mm-hmm. So if on Saturday I'm thinking through how I'm going to say this, that, and the other, the very phrases come back to me without being in writing. So I'm able to listen to myself and hold on to it. Now, the disadvantage of that is that if I want to publish something, it's the Dickens. I've got to go back and rewrite everything. Charles Swindoll.
They've got some programs now that if you play the sermon, it'll pull out all the words and type them up for you.
Well,
you need to look into that.
But then look at your manuscript; it's a mess. See, the
reason that too many ums.
Oh yeah, the reason I'm oral is that I can make mistakes, and you can cover for yourself.
Yeah,
writing is very demanding. So I've always respected Chuck Swindoll. He reads a manuscript in his sermons, but he delivers it so well
that you wouldn't.
But then he can go right to the publisher and have his sermons printed. I could never do that.
I think one thing I've found, in the difference between writing or working from what you call an oral manuscript is the difficulty of transitions. I find if I write out a sermon and then give it orally, and there's sometimes where I forget where the transitions are or things like that. And in my mind, you almost develop those more when you're doing the oral method, because if it doesn't flow naturally, you're going to forget it. Whereas with a manuscript, you know where the transitions are because there's a paragraph marker and things like that, which aren't necessarily communicated verbally to your audience who's getting it all as a single output.
Yeah, I just prefer it because, as you said, I'm speaking with my hands even today. But I guess by personality, I'm a people person. So I want to look into your eyes, and I want to see how you're responding to what I'm saying. Because if I think you're bored, I'm going to get your attention.
Yeah.
If I think you're puzzled, I'm going to go back and say it a different way. And I do that, without even thinking about it. I'm looking into the eyes of my hearers, and I'm responding to them. So we actually have a dialogue going on.
Yeah.
And so in my way of communicating, I want to see my hearers. So I've been on stages before where the Klieg lights, blind you. I don't like that.
Yeah.
I want to be able to see my hearers and the whites of their eyes, and now I can tell whether we're connecting or not. So
It's harder with Presbyterian audiences. They don't give you as much verbal feedback.
they don't. Yeah, but if you're a Presbyterian, you can read them.
Yeah.
And so that's probably the reason that I'm an oral person. It's not just that's my preferred mode of delivery, but it's because I feel like I'm connecting with the congregation.
Well, you kind of shuffle things around, like you say, oh man, I need to bring a story in here or
Yeah.
pull something from another area.
It's
So you
usually
kind of-
cutting. You're
Oh, it's
usually cutting
cutting.
as you go.
Okay.
Because I do find that I put too much in there.
Yeah.
And so, I had to cut out some things just last week, and I feel like my left arm's been cut off, but they were glad to get out on time.
Yeah.
So in an American audience, where you're limited by time in people's minds, they won't say it all the time, but they have an expectation. You have to edit. So I just find I'd rather edit as I go.
Mm-hmm.
And like you say, when you're doing it orally, the transitions come naturally.
Yeah.
And to me, it's much more natural. If I have everything in my heart and head, and now I'm just ready to talk to you,
Yeah.
I prefer that. I think I prefer to listen to someone like that.
Mm-hmm.
So basically, I developed my.
But it's probably not for everybody.
No, that's right. And like I say,
there's some-
church dwindles a
yeah.
master, and so you can preach from a manuscript and do quite well.
Yeah.
But just realize you're going to have to be personable
Yeah.
if you're reading a manuscript, and you can do it.
Yeah. I think it's harder to be personal with
It is harder, and for that reason, I just preferred to work on the discipline of memory,
Mm-hmm.
and of course, experience makes it so much easier. When you're
Yeah.
starting out, you're just so aware of yourself. You can barely catch your breath.
Yeah.
But after you've done 500 sermons, you feel more comfortable,
Yeah.
and it's more like just pastoral talking with your congregation.
I even think of, experimenting a little bit, like, well, maybe I'll try it this way and see how it goes, what I can learn. And, so, sometimes it's like, well, that was all right, but it's not for me. Or sometimes
that's right.
falls flat on its face. You think, well,
And
that
that's
was a
what your
mistake.
first years of preaching are all about. It's just getting your feet. And so you asked what I use. I progressed. I had a partial manuscript, and then I went to an outline. And now what I have is just my Bible. And I usually will have key words in the margin in pencil. And I've got a wide margin Bible.
Yeah.
So I can put a few notes there just to be sure that I've got the structure in front of me. So if I forget the details, I won't completely get off track.
Yeah.
But you have to be willing, if you go the route I'm going, you have to be willing to forget things.
Yeah.
You have to be willing to,
Sometimes you've got to trust the Holy Spirit that you're forgetting the right things.
well, that's true too. Yeah.
I sometimes think that. I think, Lord, help me to forget anything that's of me and not of you.
Yeah.
There's one temptation I think that's particular to preachers, and it's it's happened to me a couple times where I get done with a sermon, and I think this is a really great sermon about how great a sermon I'm doing, and not about how great my God is. Are there little things like that you have that kind of help you keep the focus and not get, I don't know, turn preaching into grandstanding or things like that?
Yeah. Well, this is a huge area of interest about how you focus a sermon. I do believe we should be expounding a text.
Yeah.
We should be dealing with the Word of God, and we should be devoting ourselves to it in such a way that our hearers learn how to study the Bible themselves.
Mm-hmm.
And if you make it so highfalutin and complicated that no one can follow how you did it, then they're going to think their personal devotions are worthless. How can they possibly do what you do?
I think sometimes we have the temptation to present our conclusions rather than our process, and it's like we're giving something that would be all right if they had been studying this for 7 hours, but they're coming in and hearing it fresh and then getting the conclusion of 7 hours or however long you've been working on it.
Yes. But I think if you'll just go through the text and show them, the best comment that can be made on this in this category is when a parishioner comes up to you and said, it just seems so simple. I could do that, when I study the Bible. That's what you want them to get. So simplicity, just honestly dealing with what's in the text, in the order the text presents it, is important. Now, having said that, we know everything in the Bible is about Christ. He said so in Luke 24. So it all leads to him. So if your sermon is not leading to him, you're not aware of your covenantal context. Where in the redemptive story are you? And if you're aware of that, it immediately will lead you to Christ because he's the crowning event of the whole redemptive story.
Yeah.
So everything in the Bible is in a place in the story. So one time I preached a sermon like the one you described. I thought it was really good, theologically sound, intellectually interesting. I was kind of proud of myself, and I got some compliments in the narthex. So then I'm going back to my study, and on the way I go through the sanctuary, and there's one of our senior women, and she calls me over. She says, Pastor, could I ask a favor? And I said, sure. She said, next Sunday, could you just talk about Jesus? Oh, my goodness.
That wrecks you, doesn't it?
Oh, man. I mean, that was 30 years ago, and honestly,
Yeah.
I've never forgotten. I just realized, you can do all kinds of fancy theological things, and you can forget what you're there for.
Yeah.
It's to lead people to Christ through the Word. So he's got to be the center of everything, and not in some simplistic way,
Yeah.
with an invitation at the end. But the warp and woof of the whole Bible is him. So just stay in there until you find him, as you're studying. And to me, my best devotions really are sermon preparation. People say, I want to have my own devotional life. I say, I've got it, sermon preparation. How can you possibly prepare a sermon and do it non-devotionally? How can you prepare something for me that hasn't touched your heart and changed your life?
I think I was reading about Wesley and the itinerant preachers, and that was one of the things they said. They would preach like 6 or 7 times a week on different topics, sometimes more. And they said the reason why they could do that is their devotional life and their preaching life were intertwined.
Yes.
So they largely their ministry was, expounding what they had been devoting themselves to.
Exactly. So that when you're preaching, you're sharing your devotions.
Yeah.
And you're asking them to devote themselves in the same way. I mean, it only makes sense. So the great privilege of being a Bible teacher or preacher is that you get more devotional time than anybody else.
Yeah. You get to make your living off of it.
Oh, man, it's wonderful.
Yeah. So kind of zooming back out, kind of the broad picture, what have been some of the most challenging times for you in ministry, and how did the Lord kind of bring you through it? What did you learn through those times, and kind of what's the difference between being in the midst of it and then looking back on it?
Yeah. Well, the most difficult times are just when you're under attack and by people. Now, the devil is involved in all of that. And it's complicated because you do enough bad stuff that if people want to criticize you, there's plenty to choose from.
Yeah.
But you'll find in ministry that you get these irrational complaints and charges against you, sometimes privately, sometimes publicly. And it can really take the wind out of your sails.
Yeah.
So I've just found, that what we all need is a softer heart and thicker skin. You just have to
It's a hard combination.
Oh, man. But it's what you're gunning for. So I found that experience helps with both the thicker skin and the softer heart. And those go together. If you have thin skin, you're going to have a hard heart. You may be faking it like you got a soft heart, but you don't. You're thinking about yourself. You're thin-skinned. So the thicker your skin gets, the less you think about yourself, the more compassion and pity you have for other people, even those who are attacking you. But I just found that personal attacks, and it didn't happen a lot because I've been in such nice churches.
Yeah.
But even there, you'll get these moments where sometimes you just feel besieged. I would say those are difficult moments. And then the worst of all is when you really did mess up. They're not false charges. I mean, you're being critiqued for things you really did wrong.
Yeah.
And it's depressing. So the only way you can do this is with the gospel. You've got to be able to apply it to yourself. You're telling people every week, that God loves sinners. Well, does he love you?
Yeah.
Yeah, do you believe it? Can you rejoice in it? Can you receive it? Well, you better. I mean, really, you're going to sound like a tin can if you can't experience the gospel yourself.
Mm.
If you do experience it, it's going to come out of your pores. And you're going to have the wisdom to help other people through their besieging moments. But I would say this, to me, it was the personal attacks
Yeah.
that And like I said, I didn't have a lot of them, so I'm being a wimp.
Were there any principles that helped you kind of develop that thicker skin, softer heart?
Yeah, I've just had some older brothers. I mean, I remember one of my elders in the first church I served, he was a very fine mission leader, a mission agency leader. And he's the one who told me, Sandy, you need a thicker skin and a softer heart.
Mm.
And I just watched him. You know, he didn't overreact to criticism, but he didn't ignore it. And he was able, it was almost like an out-of-body experience where he could look at himself more objectively and not worry about himself, but just manage himself. Manage himself. And I just learned, you need to be able to do that. Just manage
Almost
yourself.
treating yourself like a congregant.
Exactly. And so the more you do that, the better you're able to do it, the more useful you are. Mm-hmm. Self-perception is really important in ministry. If you don't understand how you're being perceived, you're going to make all kinds of errors. You have to be humble enough to be able to understand your place in people's lives and how they perceive you. And if you have either insecurity or a highly vaulted view of yourself, you're not going to be able to do that.
Somebody who mentored me once said, the most important question to ask anytime you receive criticism, is there any truth in that?
Yeah, right.
Even though they might be angry or irrational, even though they might exaggerate, is there any truth in it? And usually as you say, our first reaction is kind of defensive and posturing and counterattack, but being able to, all right, let's take a look at that criticism. Is there any truth in it? And sometimes I feel like, for myself, the more I react to it, the more likely there's some truth in it. If somebody calls me skinny, that's going to go off my back pretty easy because I know that's not true. If somebody says, hey, you're getting kind of chunky, kind of fat, I'm going to get upset about that, not because it's false, but because it's true.
Yeah, no, that's well said. And I can't think, as I think back on all the critiques I've gotten, I can't think of one of them that didn't have a kernel of truth in it. Not one. So you're exactly right. But also, I remember what Spurgeon said when a woman critiqued him. He said, "Madam, you don't know the half of it."
Yeah.
So you have to realize,
if they really knew, they'd have a lot better critiques.
My goodness. And I've thought often how foolish the devil is. He could have wiped me out if he had been just wiser, but he went for the jugular and missed.
Yeah.
And so I've often realized the devil doesn't even know the half of it because he doesn't know my heart. He could attack me in much fairer ways. So none of us deserve not to be criticized.
Yeah.
Even though the particular criticism may be unjust humanly.
Yeah.
Overall, it's a flea bite compared to what you deserve.
Yeah. So looking for the truth while kind of maintaining the application of God's grace into your own life kind of seems key in what I'm drawing out of what you're saying.
Yeah.
Now, there's something else you mentioned, and I thought it was a really interesting idea at the time. And you mentioned kind of, in your church and the churches that you've been a part of, you're considered an elder, and in many ways you're leading. But then there's times in which, the elder board, they go with a decision that you didn't agree with, weren't lobbying for. And then you mentioned ways in which you kind of model leadership in those situations. Would you kind of explain your views on that and how to handle it? Because I thought it was really insightful.
Well, there's kind of a combination. If you're, of course, I'm speaking from the perspective of a senior or solo minister, who is the key leader humanly. So I think there's a combination of taking initiative, which I think a senior minister should do with staff and with officers, but then listening carefully and building consensus and then putting into practice the consensus that's developed. And the consensus that's developed is usually not your original idea.
How important is it I think this step is sometimes skipped. How important is listening to building consensus, do you think?
Oh, absolutely essential. You can't build consensus without listening.
How do you draw people's views out so that you can hear them?
Well,
as the
they have
senior
to
leader?
see in you that you're willing to take contrary ideas.
Okay.
And if you get red in the face or look at your shoes or change the subject or try to bulldoze them, they'll stop bringing you contrary ideas, and you lose the advantage of the gifts of the people in your group.
That can be a really toxic place, because I feel like as a minister, if you disregard any of the ideas that are contrary to your own, there can be all these contrary ideas that exist, but you just don't hear them. People don't approach you, and I've heard stories of pastors who were surprised that they were fired because of situations like that.
Well, I would say I'm talking about people who are in your inner core to begin
Okay.
with, people you generally trust,
Mm-hmm.
and you just really have to listen to them. Now, if you're on my executive team or one of my key pastors, and we disagree, I'm going to listen to you very carefully. If I think you're off base and I can't go with you, then I'm going to explain to you why. Now, that is a very important moment. It does two things. It shows respect,
Mm-hmm.
intellectual respect for you, that I owe you a rationale because you're a trusted colleague. You're not only given the what, but you're given the why.
Yeah.
Secondly, if I'm the senior minister and I'm trying to cultivate everybody, I might be able to cultivate you by teaching you why I can't go in that direction. I'll probably influence you at least a little bit.
Yeah.
And of course, whether you are or not, you're a good man, and so you'll defer to the senior man, and as long as it's not immoral, and support what we're doing.
And it also gives them tools to support the institution. If they don't know why they're doing
That's
it,
right.
then even I've found being in a position where I have to defend a decision I didn't agree with,
Right.
but it's the institution's decision.
Right, and it's not unethical.
Yeah.
It's a prudential issue.
And then, but the better I know the reasons why it occurred, the more I'm going to be able to defend that to people who are like me and confused by the decision initially.
That's right, and it also allows you to disagree with the rationale. So if I don't give you my rationale, it's just an authoritarian, nope, we're going to do it this way.
Mm-hmm.
If I give you rationale, I'm inviting you to disagree with the rationale. So now you know why I'm doing what I'm doing, and therefore you can critique the rationale. So it actually, by explaining to you what I'm doing and why I'm doing it, it allows you to critique even more.
Mm-hmm.
Well, here's why I continue to disagree with you, Sandy, because that's exactly it, just your rationale you gave. And it'll invite you to come into it. So then what you're looking for as leader then is once you put your idea out, you listen to other ideas, you're looking for consensus, you're really looking for that consensual idea that we all buy into
Mm-hmm.
as much as possible. And that's the way I've always led. I have strong ideas, but I
Yeah.
want your ideas. And then you inevitably will reshape my original idea.
Mm-hmm.
Now, when I get to the officers, same way. Now, you asked a question about when they disagree.
Yeah.
Okay. At Second Presbyterian Church over 22 years, I probably had it happen about 4 times. That was about it. Where the session went in
And that's probably low because of the process you instituted.
I think so, plus the fact that, hey, look, it's a great church.
Yeah.
It's a unified church with mature elders. And I know I couldn't say that about the first church I pastored.
Mm-hmm.
And most guys are going into churches that have a lot more work, kind of like Nehemiah had to do, So, but in my case, I only had about 4 of these instances. Now, when they happened, in every case, I would say to those who were on the minority side, which was my side,
Mm-hmm.
Gentlemen, here's how we're going to leave this room. We're all going to put into effect the action we just passed by majority rule.
Yeah.
And I'm going to be the front, and I put myself at the front of that line. So I'm going to cheerfully implement what this session decided. So they learn from me that the pastor doesn't have to have his way all the time.
Yeah.
They also learn from me, when you're on the minority side, I'm going to expect the same behavior out of you.
Mm-hmm.
So those are your opportunities to model how you collaborate with your brothers when you didn't get your way.
Yeah.
So be sure and take full advantage of those moments when you lose a vote. That's what I would say.
And I think that's huge too, just for, prioritizing the unity of the body of Christ
Absolutely.
over my own agenda.
That's right.
Which I think tears a lot of churches apart, because there's that temptation to think, well, me and God have this view and everybody else is wrong.
I have found through the years, maybe with one exception, that every time the session disagreed with me, they ended up being right.
Well, that's a pretty humble thing to
Well, no, it's just true. I mean, any individual who puts his will up front, I mean, if you have a godly session, you can expect that when you're on the minority side, you usually missed it.
Mm.
Generally. And so I happily go along with them.
Yeah.
We've had capital campaigns I didn't agree with, and I was up front, enthusiastically supporting it. The congregation thought it was my idea.
Yeah.
And I think that's what a senior minister must do. You must represent your session. Now, if you need to argue it out, go argue. But do it with your leaders, and then come out together and implement the majority opinion.
Yeah. Is there? I mean, you've been talking a little bit about leadership and gaining consensus there. In the presentation to the congregation, rather than the session or those trusted leaders, how is building consensus different with them than it is with those leaders?
Yeah, well, in a large church, which is what second is, by the time you get to the congregational level, it's a fait accompli. I mean, you're not really looking for much input.
Yeah.
The input they have is to elect their elders. Mm-hmm. And you tip them off early enough that certain things are being considered, and if they want to jawbone any elder, they can go do it.
Okay.
So by the time, for example, you have a capital campaign, well, before we would ever do that, we've talked to 100 members in private.
Yeah.
We debriefed them, gotten their ideas. So by the time we come out publicly to the congregation, it looks like we're just saying, hey, we're going in this direction, but hey, the direction we're going is the direction you wanted to go in.
Yeah.
So
you've done a lot of research before
that's right.
that. And
that's right.
Okay.
So
okay, that makes
when
a lot
you're
of
leading
sense.
a large group, you do your research and figure out what is attainable by this group, in normal terms, and then do something that's attainable. Now, God's the God of miracles, so He can do some amazing things, and sometimes you have to take them beyond what they thought was reasonable. But generally speaking, in church leadership, under ordinary non-revival times, you're leading people to the fringes of what they see as an attainable objective.
Yeah. If you were talking to somebody just starting out in ministry, or if you went back and encountered yourself in the beginning of your ministry, what would be advice that you would pass on?
I would say, look, you've got to have your whole life integrated into your ministry and your ministry integrated into your life. Some young guys think they've got to protect their private life by putting up boundaries, here's where ministry stops and my personal life begins. And I don't think that works. If you want to know how you're going to flourish over a long period of time, how you're going to endure all the hardships and happily persevere through these difficulties, it's because it's your life. It's not something you do. And I think too many guys, it's almost like they have a career of ministry and then they have their personal life. And they overlap, but they're separated. And I'm saying, I don't think you can do that. So if Allison were not in this all the way, my wife, if my children were not flourishing, I quit.
In order to minister to them?
Yeah, that's right. If they would be better off spiritually by my being a steel salesman like I was 40 years ago, that's what I'm going to go do. So the calling for me is not to be a pastor. The calling is to be a Christian. Mm-hmm. And as a matter of fact, that's the only calling you have in the Bible, is to be a Christian or an apostle. Yeah. And since we don't have any more apostles, the only calling you've got is to be a Christian. And your calling, so to speak, to be a pastor is by inference. It's not revealed. It's inferred. Your calling to be a Christian is revealed. You're infallibly regenerated by the Holy Spirit to be a Christian. That's your calling. So then, if I'm a pastor, it's by inference, sanctified inference, prayerfully determined, with strong impulses. All that's true. But it's still an inference I'm making about this is the best way for me to live my Christian life, is by being a pastor. So I integrate my personal life completely into this. So
your identity determines your activity.
Exactly. That's how you survive, and not just survive, but abound. It's that you're in it, body and soul, just because you believe this is the best way for you to serve Jesus, and that's what it's all about. So all of your personal spiritual life, all of your values, everything, it's invested into what you're doing. Just like it is when you take a vacation with your family. You're invested completely. So I'm always invested, totally. That's the way you move through it and the way you learn, because you humble yourself to figure out how to be the best Christian you can be. And as long as you're a pastor, that's your occupational expression of your Christian faith.
Yeah.
So I just think 24/7 is the best way to organize your life. It's all integrated. So if my son has a basketball game at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, it's on my calendar.
Yeah.
It's a sacred moment. Or if I have devotions with my family, we have dinner, and then I go back out to go to the hospital, that too is a sacred moment to visit with a parishioner. And my family embraces it, and they've all benefited from it. The real key emotionally is your wife. She has to be in 100%.
I don't know if I'll call it attention, and you can correct that if you feel like it's wrong. Kind of the tension or temptation between kind of two poles. One is ignoring your family for the sake of ministry, and the other you've kind of mentioned a little bit of ignoring ministry for the sake of family. How do you deal with kind of those two poles that can be at odds at times with one another?
Well, I think it really is based on the marriage. Mm-hmm. So you need to be married to a godly woman who's ministry oriented. If you're not, you shouldn't be in full-time pastoral ministry. It just don't work. It's not going to work. There are many things you can do, and you don't need to do this. So if your wife is not enthusiastically supportive of it, don't do it. Now, having said that, how do you balance these things out? Well, look, I could be the senior minister of a 3,500 membership church, which demands about 65 to 70 hours a week. Mm-hmm. For someone of my limited skill to be effective, I have to put in that kind of time.
Yeah.
Or I could be the solo minister of a smaller church and put in about 45 or 50 hours a week. And I can just say to my wife, which would you prefer? Mm-hmm. I'm open to either one. So I would never do what I did at Second without a wife like the one I had. Mm-hmm. If I felt that she were stressed by my 65-hour-a-week work in ministry, I'd quit. And I'd go do something that suits her. So my job is to place before her the options. We can do this with this salary, live in this city with these schools, or we can do this with this salary and live in this house with these schools, or we can do this. That's, parachurch, or I can go back to selling steel. And here would be our lifestyle in each case. And honey, whichever you'd like to do, I'm happy to pull the trigger on any of them. So basically, my wife is the one that decided what house we live in, where our kids go to school, and what church I pastor.
Yeah.
She's the one who decided we come to Second. Now, I agreed with her. I thought we made a good choice. But I'm not coming if she's not in on that lifestyle.
Yeah.
Now, if she's particularly cooperative like my wife is, then you have to also be gifted at looking into their eyes and reading them and see if they're flourishing. So if I thought that I needed more time in family, but they wouldn't tell me, I'd still quit and go do something else with less salary, less privileges, less time away, and more devoted to the family. That's a choice you have to make, but I just think your wife really has to help you with that.
Yeah. Now, you mentioned 65 hours a week. You didn't do that 52 weeks a year, did you?
Well, no. I had vacation and study leave. Yeah.
So talk about those two things. How are those important, do you feel like, for long-term viability in ministry?
Okay. First of all, your rhythms have to be better than annual rhythms. If you find yourself looking forward to everybody now is talking about sabbaticals, and I think sabbaticals are fine and they're good ideas. But if you keep looking toward the sabbatical, or you can't wait for your vacation, something's wrong with your weekly schedule. Mm-hmm. You shouldn't be burned out like that. Now, I do admit, when May comes along, I'm ready for June and to get away and study and be by myself for a while. I agree. Yeah. But it's not till May.
Yeah.
So
it's not in August.
That's right. If it happens in January, I'm not managing my life very well. So you have to be sure your week has rest in it. Your week has rhythms. You're being renewed every day and every week, and not waiting for some behemoth vacation or getaway to restore your soul. That's just an unhealthy way to live. It's like trying to have a good nutritional diet by getting away 2 weeks every year and eating well.
That's a
It's
good
just,
example.
it just doesn't work. So get the whole week right. Now, you say, well, how did you do that with 65 hours? Well, I don't know. Just watch me. I mean, now I have high energy.
Yeah.
So what I was doing suited my energy level and my wife's and her emotional need level. And everybody can't do that.
Were you also in a position where you could delegate some of the areas you felt less competent or gifted in to other people?
Oh yeah, I mean that's one reason that I preferred the larger church.
Yeah.
The larger church actually covers more sins
Yeah.
than the smaller church. The smaller church, you're exposed because you're expected to do everything, and in a larger church you can specialize. And so my weaknesses were much more nicely covered.
Was there a period of time where you kind of realized, hey, I'm more of a specialist than a generalist?
Yes,
When was that in ministry for you?
I would say by the time I'm 30, early 30s, I know I want to be a pastor,
Okay.
but not until then. Then I would say, for me, it was 43.
Okay.
I knew the particular type of pastoral ministry that suited my gifts and weaknesses the best. And that's when I came to second.
Okay. And just for listeners to kind of think in these terms of categories, what did you think, hey, this is in my wheelhouse, and hey, this is stuff that's out of my wheelhouse, I maybe need to delegate or hire to protect those weaknesses?
Okay, I was afraid you were going to ask that because now you're exposing my weaknesses that get covered. And here's what they are. And I'm embarrassed, but
Well, you shouldn't be. I believe in the body of Christ, that means you can't function as a hand and a foot and be competent in both,
I know, and I agree with that,
but only in theory.
well, no, I agree with it. I agree with it completely, but I just have to add to it and say that my weaknesses are not just lack of gifting; it's the lack of heart, and that's what I'm embarrassed about. So, okay, let me tell you what it is. I always felt that I was not the first one to respond to emergencies, to go see people in the hospital when they need to be visited. I mean, for example, your dad is unbelievable at that.
Yeah.
He has a pastor's heart. He's incredible.
He's
In
showed
fact,
up before other family members have before.
Well, listen, he showed up. No, this is your dad who pastored First Evangelical here in Memphis, and my best pastoral friend. I would have my members in the hospital, and he would see them before I did. He would visit my members because he knew them and loved them, and
Yeah.
he would just put things aside. Your dad, of course, is a great biblical scholar and preacher and teacher, but he had a heart. He has a heart, and I just felt like I never had the size heart he does, and it embarrasses me. But for
He's
the
also
sake,
much less scheduled.
well, your dad would
He's
say,
the polar opposite of you in that regard, too.
Yeah, okay. Your dad would say I'm an administrative mess. That's another issue we're not talking about. But when it comes to pastoral care, I felt by comparison I'm not even in the same league as he is. But so the church is better off without that being my primary responsibility.
Yeah.
I had to realize that, and I worked on it for a dozen years. I mean, people expected me to be there, and I grunted and groaned and did the best I could, but I never reached the Ronnie Stevens status. So I've just realized, okay, I'm better off in a larger church where we have pastors who regularly are in the hospitals and ministering to people who are hurting, and they cover a lot of my sins. Now, that doesn't mean I'm not in the hospital. I am. It just means I don't have to be the first one there, and it's not for everybody. It's usually the leaders that I'm pastoring that way.
Yeah.
So that's just one. There are others, but that's, I think that's enough embarrassment for me today. But so when you're in a larger church, you can specialize. And if you're the senior leader, you're the one who's connecting with the outside world, which I enjoy. And you're the one interpreting the world and culture to your church. And so you're one of the key ones. And so I enjoyed that role. And you're leading the external mission. I enjoy that role. So it heightened the things in teaching and preaching, which I really felt like, okay, this is what I love to do.
No, that's interesting. You mentioned that you're kind of the contact person with the outside world. What would you say to a pastor who's kind of struggling to be in trying to be in the world more, but not of the world? I think, particularly as a pastor, you can be so insulated, spend all your time around church folks and church people, and just be engrossed and isolated and cloistered in that world. How did you get in the world to have a better way to explain the world?
Yeah, I would say a couple things. One is if you're in a small town, look, you can be friends with the mayor.
Yeah.
And now if you're in a large city like ours, but you're in a large church like I was, you can be a friend with the mayor. Okay, so I need to be friends with the mayor. I need to be friends with the editor of the newspaper. I need to be friends with the superintendent of the public schools. And I want to know from them, what are you struggling with? What are the big issues in city government right now? What are the big issues in the public schools? And I download all that information and it'll show up in my sermons.
Yeah.
So my sermons need to reflect that I'm connected. Now, if I'm in a small town, I can get to know the mayor. I could go down and see the high school principal. He'd love to go to lunch with me.
Yeah.
He would love for some pastor to be interested in what he does. So go down and or call the high school principal and say, hey, look, you don't know me, but I'd really like to know how our high school works. Would you explain this to me? Mm-hmm. He would love to explain it to you. And you're going to be an expert after 1-2 hour lunch on the county school system and on our local high school. Man, you're going to know him. He's going to be your friend. You can quote him. Woo! That helps a lot with preaching. And it also helps with your school teachers that are in your school, in your church. Oh, man, so you know Mr. So-and-so? Oh, well, yeah, he's my boss. Yeah, I know. He thinks a lot of you. We talked about you. I mean, it just connects you with people's world. The same thing, you can go to the local hospital, ask to meet the chief administrator, take him to lunch, and ask him how medical care is working in your county. I mean, all these ways, you need to be connected to the real world your people are living in. Now, I enjoy that.
Yeah.
Now, getting out of the office to go do that, that's a no-brainer.
Yeah, you're getting excited right now
That's
just talking
right.
about
And it's selfish. It's just, that's the part that embarrasses me, is that there's a part of it that's missional and strategic, and there's a part of it, hey, Sandy loves to do that.
Well, I think it's okay to have some joy as a Christian in ministry.
Yes. Well, yeah, that's right. And sometimes your flesh actually, in your flesh there's no good thing, but sometimes it collaborates.
You also mentioned in our last conversation, and especially coming from a non-ministry vocation, switching into ministry, you kind of noticed people started treating you differently once you were a pastor or had that title. And you kind of described to me there were certain ways you leaned into that. Can you explain kind of how you noticed that and what your strategy was for dealing with it?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, I leaned against it. I mean, I didn't like it. And there are various reasons for it. I was kind of embarrassed to be a pastor, I think.
Yeah.
It seemed, maybe the Hollywood had gotten to me. It just seemed to be a weak role with weak people who were just nice all the time, didn't really have much spine.
Yeah.
And it just, the whole image of being a pastor, I didn't want. And what happened was, after about 3 years of pastoral ministry, I realized that my embarrassment was not just occupational. I was actually embarrassed by the gospel, because the pastor is a public representative of the gospel itself. So I repented. So it used to be, when I was initially a pastor, the last thing I'm going to ask you on the airplane is, what do you do for a living? Because I don't want you to ask me.
Yeah.
After my conversion to embracing the pastoral office, the first thing I ask you is, what do you do for a living? Because I want you to ask me, because when you do, I'm going to be able to say, well, I'm a Presbyterian pastor, and my interest is in people's spiritual life. Tell me about yours.
Yeah.
So, these poor lay people, they have to talk about football and the weather and all kinds of things to build a bridge. I don't have to build a bridge.
You have
I
a
just go
built-in
right for the
bridge.
jugular. Yeah, I'm a pastor. It's my profession. So I found, once I embraced my role in life, and that's what I mean by integration.
Yeah.
You want to be friends with me? I'm a pastor. So if you're friends with me, you'll have a pastor as your friend. And my interest in our conversations will be pastoral, because that's who I am. So once I adopt that, take that cloak on, it changes everything. And now I'm aggressively engaged in the mission, regardless of the person I'm conversing with.
What were some of the things that you noticed changed once you embraced that?
I noticed that once you see yourself as a pastor, so does everybody else. So it's like self-respect. Don't expect me to respect you if you don't respect yourself. I'm cueing off of you. And if you'll show respect for your own time and energy and commitments, it inspires a respect in me. Same thing, if I respect my office and I know what I'm doing and I know I have every right and responsibility to ask you about your relationship with Jesus Christ. It may take you aback a little bit, but eventually you'll say, well, I guess he's right. Maybe he does have a right to ask me that. Most of the time. Now, sometimes it's offensive. Too bad for you. But, it begins with seeing yourself as a spiritual leader. And I tell elders this too. Biggest problem the elders have is not seeing themselves as elders. They don't realize the authority they have as an elder in the church.
That's real interesting. I was reading something this morning, actually, that was about the Puritans' view of church leadership and how essentially most of the persecution they endured was based around their views of church government and what a high regard they had for it. And as somebody who's in an even lower church setting than you as a Presbyterian, that's something I'm really trying to think through and embrace and understand better.
Woodrow Wilson was president of Princeton University. He was president of the United States. He said the highest honor I ever had was being elected an elder in the Presbyterian Church.
Oh, wow.
So he was a churchman. He understood that trumps everything. It defines who you are more than your occupation does. So if you're an elder in the church, you're a shepherd. You can't go any higher, if I could put it that way, than being a shepherd. Jesus was a shepherd. He wants every human being to be a shepherd. And so you're appointed a particular type of shepherd in the church. You're modeling what the new humanity is to be about.
Yeah.
So embrace it. Take it on.
One of the things I've thought about recently, I'm just going to throw it out and see if you have any thoughts, is, having a rightly ordered life. And one of the things I think of in terms of order is relational. And am I rightly ordered under Christ, and am I rightly ordered over the things he's given me responsibility for? In ministry in particular, how do you view those dynamics?
Well, it's like Paul, you plan, and then the Holy Spirit says, I got other plans.
Yeah.
So Steve Brown used to say, if you want to make God laugh, tell him your plans.
Yeah.
But that's half the truth. The other half is you should plan. So you've got important things to do. So let's plan to the best of our ability and then expect God to interrupt and give you his plan. So it's both and. So you organize things under you, but the most important thing is you're being organized by the deity. And you're humbling yourself under his word, and you're also humbling yourself under his providence. And you realize that he's taking charge of your life. If you get a diagnosis of cancer, like I did, that changes your schedule.
Yeah.
And the things you have to put your time into. That's God's providence. I humble myself under that and realize he's teaching me certain things. So it's both and. And that's what Paul did when he couldn't go into Bithynia and the Lord took him to Macedonia. It was because God trumped his plans. And fortunately, Paul, although strong-willed person, he was able to have this sort of sensitivity to the work of the Spirit in his life. So he headed off for Macedonia, not knowing where he was going. Think about it. He traveled week upon week, not knowing where in the world the Spirit was taking him. All he knew, he was supposed to go west. So he gets to the end of Asia. He's run out of landmass. Still doesn't know where he's going until he has the dream and the vision of the Macedonian man. So Paul was sensitive to the providence of God even when he didn't know where in the world it was taking him. And we have to be the same way.
I think that's one of the hardest places to be in ministry
is
to know you're not at your final destination and to not know where the Lord's redirecting you yet. And, sometimes I feel like once I get the lesson, I'm okay with what God's doing. But to be okay before you get the lesson, before you get the final answer, just living properly under that providence. Any tips for that?
My flesh hates it. Well, just keep reading the Bible.
Yeah.
Just keep studying people. I mean, Moses in the wilderness for 40 years. Yeah. What am I doing out here? I'm kind of enjoying life, with my family. Yeah. But for 40 years, doesn't have his direct ministry. And then at 80 years of age, he gets appointed. I mean, you just study the Bible and see that God uses people at different times. And that doesn't mean that you're always in the fast lane for 80 years. Sometimes you feel sidetracked, and those are very constructive times. Even the Apostle Paul, he gets converted. He tries to preach, has some effect, but everybody's relieved when he leaves the city because he's causing trouble. So what does he do? He studies for 14 years, relearns the Old Testament from a Christocentric perspective, and then he's ready to come out for the next 20 years and be the chief apostle. So those 14 to 17 years were extremely important. And if he had been just coddling himself, he wouldn't have been ready for the 20 years of his last 20 years. So I would just say, you think you're side road, you think you've been forgotten. No. This is a very important constructive time. You just have to keep preaching to yourself.
Yeah. Those are helpful illustrations to remind us of God's goodness even when we don't understand his providence.
That's right.
Well, Sandy, I could keep asking you questions all day, but
please don't. Let's go get something to eat.
All right, but I just want to thank you so much for your time and for sitting down and just sharing the ways in which God has worked in you, on you, and through you, and appreciate your ministry in this city and now in other areas. I just have enjoyed this so much. Thank you.
Thanks, Seth. Great to be with you.
Next time, we'll be interviewing Dr. James Allman, one of the smartest people I know, and someone who will bring a little bit more of a literal sense to the idea of surviving ministry. If this podcast has been encouraging to you, we'd love to hear from you. Drop us a line at survivingministrypodcast@gmail.com. Until next time, congratulations, you survived this podcast.